This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Another day, another gubernatorial candidate. Today, Oz Griebel joins us in studio and on Facebook Live. Griebel's running unaffiliated against 4 other candidates in the Connecticut governor's race. He's a recognizable name within the Hartford region. That's because Griebel ran the MetroHartford Alliance. It's the Greater Hartford Chamber of Commerce for 17 years. And back in 2010, he ran in the Republican primary for governor. Why is he trying again? And with 3 weeks to go before Election Day, can he push past the 2 major party candidates that have the money to spend statewide? You can join our conversation. Here's the studio number, 860-275-7266. As I mentioned, we're on Facebook Live. Hello to our viewers out there. Just search Where We Live, and you can add your question right below that live video stream. And as always, find us on Twitter @WhereWeLive. I want to welcome Oz Griebel back to our studio. Again, the unaffiliated candidate for the governor of Connecticut. Oz, welcome back.
Delighted to be here, Lucy.
Last time you were on the show, I believe it was the summer of 2017, and I asked you about whether you were interested in running. There were rumors. You wouldn't budge, and you told me whether you run or not, you want to be part of the solution.
Right.
So now you're running.
I am running.
Why should people vote for you?
Well, as Monty Frank, my running mate, and I have said, and by the way, Monty and I came together as a partnership back in December. We're not the product of a shotgun marriage from Republican or Democratic primaries. And that, to me, is a big difference for starters. But most importantly, what we've said that is only an independent governor, an independent lieutenant governor, can bring both parties together, the moderates particularly in both parties, and the private sector, to promote this great state, the great assets we have, and to address these formidable fiscal challenges that are undermining the long-term future of the state. We've had no net job growth in the state in 30 years. As a result, we've had higher taxes, more taxes, still underinvested nonetheless in transportation, education, and other things, and have led to the out-migration of people of all age levels and all income levels. So it's only that independent governor that can take the two-party system back, take Connecticut back from a two-party system that really has failed the voters here over the last 30 years.
I mentioned earlier you ran in the Republican primary for governor in 2010. But tell us about your experience for people outside the Greater Hartford region who may not know you.
Well, my experience, you mentioned my professional experience, but let me just expand on it. Both Monty and I have lived and worked in the state of Connecticut, but we have worked for the state of Connecticut for the past 25 years. Let me just talk briefly about Monty. He's a partner at Pullman and Comley. He's been active in the Connecticut Bar Association, immediate past president. As a result, he's worked on a number of key issues like homelessness for veterans, addressing the opioid crisis. But the thing that's probably tells most about who Monty is as a person is he's a Sandy Hook resident, competitive cyclist, and then after the tragedy, the massacre down in Sandy Hook 6 years ago, formed something called Team 26, which is 26 cyclists representing one of them, each of them representing one of the victims of that horrible shooting, to ride from Newtown to D.C. to put a focus on the need for federal legislation to reduce gun violence. My background includes, in addition to the 17 years at the MetroHartford Alliance, it includes having worked for 22 years with Bank of Boston, the last 6 of which were here in Connecticut. As president of our Connecticut and Western Massachusetts operations, I served for 2 years as the COO of McDermott Corporation, a specialty chemicals company in Waterbury, and as you mentioned, the last 17 as CEO of the MetroHartford Alliance. In addition to all of that, those jobs have provided me the opportunity to do things like chair the Connecticut Transportation Strategy Board, serve on a number of for-profit and not-for-profit companies, and be very involved in public policy matters both at the state and municipal level to create an environment where the private sector wants to keep the jobs that are here and expand additional jobs.
I watched the Connecticut Broadcasters Association debate last night, and I believe then you said that you're an outsider. You really stressed that you and Monty would be independent of this two-party system. But I think back to the fact that you've been a player in the Greater Hartford region for almost 20 years. You've been a leader during several administrations, governor administrations at the Capitol. So if people were to cast their vote for you, would you really be a new voice in the Capitol? Who are the people that you would bring in to your departments? Would they just be the same political names and appointees we've seen in the past?
Well, I think, first of all, I don't believe we've used the word outsider. What we've tried to demonstrate, as I just said in that prior answer, is the experience that we bring, the networks that we bring, the understanding of how government works. Being an outsider, just for being an outsider, and saying you're going to run government like a business is a lot of intellectual hoo-ha. The point that we've made is we've got relevant experience. We're also reaching out as we've gone around the state over the last 9 months, talking with businesses, talking with hospitals, talking with not-for-profit groups, talking with faith community. We've encouraged people to give us the names of folks they would like to see on the transition team, and give us the names of people they think should be in major commissioner positions, particularly in areas like DECD and OPM and the like that really drive the state. So we're looking to open that up. We've been very clear that inclusion and diversity is a key component of this campaign and a key component of our administration. So we probably will bring some folks in who've had meaningful experience, but at the same time, we want to make sure that the administration has got the right perspectives and the right experiences in, so that we're leveraging the extraordinary intellectual talent that is in this state.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Oz Griebel is in studio with me. He is the unaffiliated candidate running in the Connecticut governor's race. You can join the conversation, 860-275-7266. We're also on Facebook Live. Just search Where We Live and add your question below that live video stream. So this has become a redundant message in the governor's race, but one of the biggest challenges is to fill these multi-billion-dollar deficits that Connecticut is facing. What new ideas are you bringing, Oz?
Well, I have to say, one of the things that frustrates me in these debates is we leave this question to the very end, as it was left to the very end again last night. It is with the issues around immigration and who we might appoint to the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court. They're all very important issues. But sitting at the heart, and the primary motivation for Monty and me to run is to redress the fiscal challenges here, restore employment growth of the state of Connecticut. And as you pointed out, the two biggest impediments we have to that kind of growth is the $4.6 billion operating deficit that we're facing in the first biennium, the $80 billion unfunded pension liability, and the unfunded retiree health care. These are significant issues. This is not child's play, and as we've said, somebody's going to come in and say they're going to solve this by eliminating or reducing the personal income tax, or by saying you're going to return as Ned says, I'm going to bring the minimum wage up to $15 an hour. If you believe those are the solutions, I've got plenty of bridges to sell you in a heartbeat. This is serious matter, and when you look at the next biennium, the $40 billion estimated revenues, expenses that are in there, about 40% of that's already allocated at 12:01 a.m. of July 1st to fund servicing existing debt, funding pension obligations, and addressing the state retiree health care costs, the overall health care costs. So you're looking at balancing this budget on about $28 billion, not $40 billion. And what we have said, and we've been very clear on this, we are going to look at bringing the rainy day fund in, because if this isn't a rainy day fund, I don't know if this isn't a storm, I don't know what a deluge looks like. So that's what the rainy day fund is there for. We would take that in over the 2 years, and we would look at every line item that doesn't require funding in the biennium and determine whether we could either eliminate or postpone that in the biennium. So that includes looking at the funding of the ARC, which is counterintuitive. That's the contribution to the state retiree and teacher pension plans, in exchange for getting long-term stability in those funds over the next couple of years.
Is that a new idea? Because when we think about deferring payments to the pension and health retirement funds for employees, isn't that why we're in the mess we're in now?
We are, but let's take a look at what your alternatives are. I mean, when people say, "Well, that's irresponsible," is that irresponsible, or is it irresponsible to cut aid to municipalities? Is it irresponsible to cut aid to agencies that are serving the most vulnerable around us? Is that reckless as opposed to closing state parks? I mean, we do not have lots of nice, pleasant choices in front of us. And my point, what we've been saying, is we want to buy 2 years of some breathing room in order to get some structural changes in. There are no opportunities to lay off any state employees. Not that that's a goal, but you can't do that under the current agreement with the unions. So we've got to have honest discussions, not sort of this poll-tested pablum that you get from the two major parties, which I believe, Monty and I are confident, the voters are going to regurgitate that kind of nonsense and look at what the real look seriously at leadership that's going to focus on them as taxpayers and residents.
Jocelyn on Facebook writes she thinks an independent person won't win win. And unfortunately, thinks a vote for you, Oz, will be a wasted vote. She says she's going to vote for Ned. How do you respond to
Well,
that?
first of all, you vote for Ned or Bob. That's where the wasted vote is. You're looking at continuation of what's happened over the last 30 years of no net job growth, increased taxes, and out-migration. It's 4 more years of continued decline into mediocrity. And I just tell her and any other viewer, remember that of the 2.1 million registered voters in the state, 900,000 are registered as unaffiliated. Yes, people lean to the RRD, but they registered as unaffiliated for a reason. The other thing is, please don't try to determine how your neighbor's going to vote or how your spouse is going to vote or how someone down in Stamford or Torrington is going to vote. Vote for the ticket that you believe is best. And to me, well, people say that choices, like Ned's saying the only choice is between Bob and Oz, and Bob will say the only choice is between Ned and Oz. No, the choice is between Oz or continued mediocrity that both the other major party candidates represent.
Here's the number, 860-275-7266, if you want to ask Oz Griebel, the unaffiliated candidate running in Connecticut governor's race. If you want to ask him a question, that's the number. Paul has been holding from Ellington. Paul, go ahead.
Oz, you got my vote, so there's
Thanks,
one.
Paul.
Listen, given the 4.6 operating deficit in the next budget year,
Right.
What is your position on the practice that includes excessive overtime for 3 years only to be included in the calibration of the pension pay, better known as pension padding?
Yes.
In the 2017 CBAC agreement, this practice was changed from 100% to be included to 60% overtime.
Right.
Do you think it is time to eliminating these type of practices entirely?
Absolutely, Paul. And I think even more importantly, we have to move to a defined contribution plan for employees and not a defined benefit plan. And I say this, I want to be really clear. We respect and want talented people in state government. We want and respect talented people in municipal government. These positions are critical to the way the state operates, the way that services are delivered. So I want to be clear that when we're talking about this isn't about demonizing state employees or municipal employees. It's not about demonizing union leadership. It's about being honest with state employees and municipal employees about what we can do. The challenge with defined benefit plans is, number one, we overpromise, and your comment about the overtime is clearly in that category, and then we don't fund the obligations. So the chickens have come home to roost with a vengeance right now, and we have to have honest discussions both about how we're going to honor the obligations that have been negotiated for current retirees and those who are close to retirement, but we have to move current employees into a defined contribution plan. Yes, it has an impact on current operating expenses. You have to take that into account in the operating budget, but it's a more honest, straightforward approach to both the state employee and teacher and municipal employee, as well as to the taxpayer. It has to be part of the long-term approach to our fiscal issues.
Oz, how would you rate the job that Malloy and his administration, as they negotiate with labor unions, have they been giving away too much?
Well, you have to go back to this is a 30-year problem. Anybody who says this is Governor Malloy's problem only is not taking a hard look at the history of this state. And if you go back to the Governor Rowland, who first had the 15-year agreement with CBAC, which never made any sense to me, I'm going to just go back a tad in history when I say we're in this problem over 30 years. We ran surpluses in this state from 1999 to 2001 to the tune of about $5.5 billion. And when the income tax was approved back in the 90s, the concept was that any surpluses were only to be used for servicing existing debt, funding pension funds, or funding the rainy day fund, unless the governor and 60% of the legislature agreed to a quote, declaring a quote emergency. Well, that's what we did in 99 to 2000. So instead of $5.5 billion all going into one of those three categories, about $4 billion went into de facto into the operating budget. Now, I'm sure there were a lot of great projects that came out of that, but it began to undermine the confidence that residents and employers have in this state that the state is going to do what it says with the money that they collect from us as taxpayers.
I'm going to take a call in just a minute, but I wanted to just follow up. It's interesting that you talk about how the intent was one thing, but then legislators and leaders did another.
Right.
Isn't that the same argument when you hear your opponent say he doesn't want to support tolls? This is Bob Stefanowski,
Right.
because he doesn't trust that the legislature will use that money towards transportation. So how do you answer
Well,
that?
absolutely. So we're highly supportive of the amendment that's on the November 6th ballot to create the so-called lockbox. It's not drafted the way I would want to draft it, but at least it's a step in the right direction, and it will give me a club to make sure we beat off any folks that are trying to raid the fund for the current gasoline tax or any other fund that goes into that. It's a significant step in the right direction and one that we clearly support.
I want to take another call now. James is calling from Roxbury. James, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. It's clear a lot of young people and even families with children are leaving Connecticut. So my old elementary school is on the verge of closing due to low attendance. I've since left the state for job opportunities. I'm just wondering what the candidate is hoping to do to bring more young people or families back to the state to stay for the long term.
Great question. I appreciate that. Appreciate it. The first and foremost, I'll repeat what I said earlier. Job growth is the most important thing we have. People will move to this state, stay in this state, if they have an opportunity to earn a living, if they have an opportunity to support their families, if they have an opportunity to pursue their dreams. As I said earlier, we've had no net job growth in this state in 30 years. We lost 120,000 jobs back in the 89 to 91 real estate implosion. It took about 12 years to get them back. We lost another 120,000 in the international financial debacle of 07, 08. We've recovered maybe 100 to 110,000 of those. The jobs coming back this time are at lower median wage. The governor has to be the chief marketing officer for this state, first and foremost focusing on the adage that your next best customer is your current customer, which means spending a lot of time with current employers in the business sector, the hospital sector, the higher education sector, to make sure that the jobs that are here today stay here and that the next job that those entities add are here in Connecticut, not in South Carolina, New Hampshire, or anywhere else. Begin to listen to them. Tell them that they're appreciated, that we appreciate what they're doing with having their employees here, appreciate their taxes that they pay, the investments they make in property and real estate equipment and R&D. It's communicating that message, and by doing that, we have a legitimate shot at recruiting companies and individuals particularly from New York and Boston. Our proximity to those two areas is our single biggest asset, and as expensive as Connecticut is, we have a great comparison to commercial real estate, residential real estate costs in those two areas. And even with the congestion we have here in Connecticut, it's a relative day at the beach compared to congestion inside of 128 in the Boston area compared to the commute into the New York and Westchester County areas.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Oz Griebel's here. He's the unaffiliated candidate running in Connecticut's governor's race. We're going to take more of your questions for him. After the break, here's the number, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook Live. Add your question or comment right below that live stream. And we'll be back after a short break. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Oz Griebel, he's one of 5 candidates running in Connecticut's governor's race. He's on the ballot after collecting enough signatures to qualify for the general election. He's been a registered Republican and also tried running for governor as a Republican in the 2010 primary. This time he's running unaffiliated. And today's your chance to ask Oz Griebel a question. The studio number, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook Live, add your question below the video stream, or on Twitter @Where We Live. Now, publicity surrounding your candidacy was certainly helped recently, Oz, by a creative Wethersfield man. To the listeners out there, have you heard this rap?
You want a man of the people. Get out your house and vote for Griebel. In his powerful card, Monty Python pylon, but I got my money on Griebel. You want a man of the people.
That's from the People for Griebel rap, produced
Yes.
by a creative Wethersfield, Connecticut resident, Ian McDonald. What did you
Right.
think about that, Oz?
Oh, it was it's a great compliment. When we've had so many people have done some great things for us, letters to the editor, writing op-ed pieces, promoting us. What Ian did is just it epitomizes the growing momentum that we've had, and for someone like that, I'd never met Ian before. In fact, when he first published it, we couldn't find out who had actually authored it. And then to have that kind of commitment, I've had a chance to talk with him personally. In fact, he came to a function last night. I had a chance to meet him in person. That kind of energy, that kind of commitment, that kind of passion characterizes this campaign, and it's given us, no question, that rap has given us a very nice boost. We really appreciate it.
I wanted to go back to tolls. We asked briefly earlier. Cynthia on Facebook writes, I drive the Mass Pike frequently, so she's not against tolls. However, the Mass Pike has fully functional rest stops available at all hours.
Yes.
They charge a higher rate for out-of-state transponders.
Correct.
And then she goes on to say, considering all Connecticut drivers have out-of-state transponders, I also have one, would Connecticut charge the same rate across the board? And will the state reopen our rest stops beyond 8:30 to 3:30?
Well, it's a great question, and I know that what you're talking about is 84, because on 95, obviously, the rest stops have been contracted out, so you have rest stops along I-95. There are none on I-91, I don't believe. There's one rest stop. Yeah, so you have a couple of rest stops on I-81 and then the ones on 84. And one of the things I've talked to the tourism groups about is entering into private-public partnerships where either chambers of commerce or others would come in and run those rest stops. It's critical that the rest stops send not only to Connecticut residents who might want to use the rest stop, but as importantly, having information at those rest stops for tourists and people looking for information. To say that they're closed sends a horrific signal, particularly when you see it on the sign that it's only open it's closed from X to Y. On the tolls, I just vigorously disagree with Governor Malloy's $10 million study of tolls. We've done studies in the past, as I've said, apropos of the viewer's comment. We could just drive up and knock on Charlie Baker's door in Massachusetts and get their playbook. To answer the question on the different rates, yes, what I think Massachusetts has done, there's a tiered rate in there for not only cars but also for trucks, depending on where they're registered. There has been no constitutional challenge to any of that. That makes a lot of sense to me. I want to emphasize that tolls in this argument over the last 20 years, and I've been for tolls since I chaired the Transportation Strategy Board, has become it's the classic example of partisan politics. A Republican can't be for tolls. A Democrat has to be for them. And we're not focusing on the transportation strategy and the priorities we need. What I've said is that it will take 2 or 3 years to get federal government approval to put tolls on because of the tragedy that occurred back in the 80s and the federal government stepping in. But I believe we could get in the near term, by July 1, for example, of next year, the ability to put tolls on the HOV lanes in 84 and 91. Make sure that we protect the individuals who are carpooling so that they aren't either getting charged or they're getting charged at a lower rate. But my point on that is by putting a pilot in, we can experiment with these things. How you deal with transponders, we could experiment with something like congestion pricing, which is something has to be part of the long-term solution when tolls are put on I-95 and 91. So those things have to be all part of the discussion.
Often when we talk about transportation, naturally we think about who's driving and the condition of our roads. But what about an emphasis on getting cars off of our roads? Maybe investing more in public transit. What's your take on the Hartford line these last few months and Fast Track as well?
Well, Fast Track, we're a longtime supporter of it. One thing I would like to look at is whether we'd be able to open that 9-mile stretch up to some of the private carriers like DATCO. I don't know what the federal implications of that are, but the idea of making that potentially available to reduce some of the congestion on 84 in both the morning and the evening rush hours, I think is something we need to look at. I mean, everybody says we need to invest more in mass transit, but that's where the money issue comes in. I mean, everybody said we need to do more. Fine, let's talk about how we're going to fund it. And whether that has to have some kind of an increase in the gasoline tax in the near term, whether that's the electronic toll concept that we're just talking about, that's what's needed. And when you look at the capital projects that we're faced with in this state on the roads, the viaduct on I-84 going through Hartford, the Route 8 84 interchange in Waterbury, the bridges on Metro North, we have significant deferred maintenance issues that have to be dealt with. I'm very concerned about the longevity of the New Haven to Springfield line because of the I don't know the answers to how much has been budgeted for the subsidies. And when you look at the issue of subsidy and where you're going to what the priorities are going to be with the finite transportation dollars we have, that's going to be a real challenge for us as we go forward. We're cutting service on the Danbury lines and the Waterbury lines. This is not a healthy place for us to be. We know we need more bus service, particularly in some of our rural areas. So they're trying to look at the entire transportation responsibilities and initiatives are critical.
Oz Griebel's here on Where We Live, the number 860-275-7266. Chris is calling from New Haven. Chris, go ahead.
Hi, Oz. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
You know, I like your pragmatic approach. However, you lost my vote regarding the CBAC agreement and going from a defined benefit to a defined contribution. I think by doing that, I mean, you don't talk about the various tiers that the unions have come and negotiated.
Right.
Right now, an employee coming into the state government, to be honest with you, the plan is junk.
Yep.
It really isn't. And you want to attract good, qualified people. You want to attract engineers to work for our DOT.
Correct.
You want to attract high-quality attorneys to work for our Attorney General's
Right.
office. By weakening the pension and whittling down the benefits is not going to attract the best and the brightest to Connecticut government. And I'm sorry, you just lost my vote on that.
Thank you, Chris, for your call. How do you respond?
Sure,
to Oz?
and I appreciate that. I'm sorry I lost your vote. I hope over the next 2 weeks you'll reconsider. I'm all for taking a hard look at what the competitive salaries ought to be. I think that to me is trying to get this into more what I would refer to as a private sector mentality, where benefits are clearly a key component of this. But looking at the base salary, looking at the portability of a 401k, the number of people over the years that have told me they stay for the extra 2 years of service or 4 years of service in order to get the guaranteed health care benefits, to me that's the wrong reason to stay in a position. If you've got a better opportunity to go somewhere else, you ought to do that and not have people tied down for something that allows them to say, okay, if I stay this long. So I'm all for trying to recruit using base compensation and a competitive benefit package, both in terms of the 401k component and the health care component, both currently and long term. That's got to be part of this issue. But one of the things I'll say to you, Chris, and to the viewers, we're not having an honest discussion about whether we can fund the obligations that we have. We've got an $80 billion unfunded liability problem on our hands. When I say to people, are you confident, those who are earning their retirement checks today, are you confident you're going to get that retirement check in 20 years? And I think that's a serious concern that we have to have a discussion about. We've got basically our teacher retirement and employee retirement funds are funded at about 30% of what actuarial values or what actuaries would say they should be. They're essentially bankrupt. If we don't get growth in this state, 200,000 net new jobs, we're not going to reduce this horrific pitting of retirees against 3-year-olds that I think have emerged. That's what I'm trying to get at, so that we're honoring the obligations, we're giving people flexibility when they come to work for the state or the municipality, and as a result of having a competitive compensation package, we are attracting the best and the brightest into these very, very important state and municipal positions.
You can join our conversation on Where We Live. Rick is calling from Wethersfield. Rick, we've got about 10 minutes, so quickly to your question.
All right, thank you for taking my call. You have my vote.
Thanks, Rick.
The two parties have failed us over the years, but I want to talk about the bonding commission, which
Sure.
I like to call the incumbent reelection campaign
Yes,
fund.
it is. Yep.
Because why in Wethersfield should the state be borrowing money to build a Little League field and put
Agreed.
lights on our football field when we
Agreed.
can't afford to fix the roads and bridges?
You're spot on, and the use of bonding in this state for the last 30 years has been, I don't know if you used the word, but it's been abused. And I think that the governor has to be the person, and that's what Monty and I are talking about, that we're the people who are coming, the ticket that's coming in to put some responsibility and focus on taxpayers, residents, and employers. And as much as that Little League field in Wethersfield is important, as much as the acquisition of the land to expand riverfront recapture, I chaired that board for a number of years. Those are all very important things to do. But to put that on a bonding commission when all we're doing is kicking the proverbial can down the road, to me is not the right use of that kind of thing. It's a little bit like if you went out and put a second mortgage on your home to go on and use the money to go on vacation. That's not why you put a second mortgage on the house. You do it maybe to finance your children's education or to replace the roof on your house, but you're not doing it for things that ought to come out of your personal operating budget the same way that we ought to be looking at these things out of the individual municipal or state operating budgets.
Jennifer's calling from Avon. Jennifer, go ahead.
Hi, I'm wondering what Connecticut can do to counteract or lessen the consequences of climate change,
Right.
which seems pretty dire given the report that was recently released by the UN.
Thank you.
Thank you for the call. And this came up last night in the Connecticut Broadcasters Association debate, and I made the comment there that two things. One is that as serious climate change is very serious. We've got it right here, rising sea levels along the coastlines. These are big issues. The opportunities potentially to expand our renewable energy, the delivery of energy through renewables is a big deal. And what I've said is that to me, Connecticut is in as good a position as any other state in the country to not only use our intellectual capital here, whether it's in fuel cells, wind technology, solar panels, the other things that are making sure that we have Millstone is kept functioning in terms of delivering its power down there. Those are things that we have here that can not only help us reduce our energy costs, but as importantly, help with employment. We've got great R&D capability down at the Yukon Avery Point branch that deals with some of these meteorological issues. We ought to be using the intellectual capital here to do two things, to not only solve the problems that we can in Connecticut, where we can, but also to use that intellectual capital to increase our employment in these areas and to be a national leader on all these key issues that you're referencing. To me, it's something trying to look at the glass half full. As serious as climate change is, and it is serious, how do we take advantage of the experience, capital, including the expertise we have in venture capital in this area, and make sure this is something we use to Connecticut's benefit on all fronts.
When we look at damage caused by storms and what's happening along the shoreline, you said at that debate, we need to also look at this policy to rebuild. Is that easier said than done given who lives along the shore?
Well, it is, but I think this gets into this is where I think when you look at some of the expertise we have in DEEP, we look at the expertise we have at Yukon at Avery Point. You look at the expertise and the focus that our major property and casualty insurance companies are on this. There's a lot of research that's being done by Travelers and by the Hartford on this because they're the ones that have to deal with this issue in terms of underwriting, not only underwriting policies, but then ultimately paying claims. That's where the intellectual capital comes in on this, and the idea of and some of this obviously comes into the National Flood Insurance Program, should we be encouraging people to go back and rebuild the same way? We've had the damage that was done by the last two major storms earlier in this decade certainly underscores the fragility of the shoreline. It certainly underscores the danger, the physical danger that people are facing when storms come in that way, and it clearly underscores the importance of where do we want to put both private and public capital when a storm hits and does the kind of damage that we've had earlier in this decade.
We're getting a comment from Melvin on Facebook who writes, reductions in our Department of Correction population is a straightforward solution to bring down taxpayer costs. Correct. What percentage reduction in the DOC population are you willing to commit to if you're elected governor?
Well, I don't know whether I'd commit to a percentage, but the point is spot on, and it's everything from making sure that we've got fair policies in terms of who's arrested for what violations. It takes a look at our whole bail system to make sure that people aren't being held in prison because of their inability to raise bail on what I'll call offenses that don't involve violence. I think those are things that need to be looked at. Clearly, some of the things that Governor Malloy has done and his administration have done on the Second Chance program to facilitate people who have served time coming back into the community with the right skill sets so the rates of recidivism are reduced. These things are comprehensive. The other thing, when I said this last night, it's not just the prison population that we've got to look at. We've got to look at what are we doing at the front end to reduce the likelihood that someone will go to prison. So the whole area of education, pre-K education, we know that a child who doesn't read at grade level by third grade, the chances of them being incarcerated, particularly a male, goes up significantly. Those things all have to be part of this discussion.
So often the focus, again, is on economic development, trying to keep people here, bring businesses into the state, Oz.
Right.
But quality of life also depends on arts and culture.
Correct.
And if you're elected governor, what are you going to do for that community?
Well, I'm going to say what I said, but I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. Our most important responsibility responsibility right now in this first budget is do the least amount of damage as possible. That means using the rainy day fund. It means looking at not funding the ARC, so we don't have to cut in this. I mean, the fact that there's anybody who thinks there's going to be more money coming in these next 2 years, again, I'll sell you. I've got a whole inventory of bridges I'll be happy to sell you. We have to take serious look about how we're going to protect our parks, how we're going to protect funding for arts and education. Where can we have greater partnerships between some of our arts and cultural organizations and the public school systems, where many public school systems have had to cut out arts and humanities and cultural amenity as part of the education program. Those things are critical to have the right people in the room, having the right discussions so that our priorities stay in line. But I'll go back and beat this $4.6 billion operating deficit dead horse one more time. Our responsibility is to make sure that we do not raise taxes in the next 2 years. That would send a horrific signal to the private sector, both residents and employers. And at the same time, we need to protect the appropriate aid to support to education, to transportation, and to arts and cultural organizations. So to me, having creative ways of bringing the public and private sector together on these next 2 years is going to be critical to make sure we're supporting those very important organizations that you referenced.
So for the short term, to deal with those multi-billion-dollar deficits, using the rainy day fund, deferring some pension contributions, what would be your goal the first 90 days, Oz?
Well, we would do things like first of all, we've got to develop the budget. So that sitting right up at the top, the first three priorities are the budget, and the budget. We'll start developing that on November 7th. We have to submit it, obviously, in February. The most important point I would make is that every decision we make has to be done on the basis, does it strengthen Connecticut's ability to increase on a net basis 200,000 new jobs in the private sector? That's got to be at the heart of everything we're doing, including that budget.
Oz Griebel, unaffiliated candidate in the Connecticut governor's race. Oz, thank you.
Real pleasure. Vote line 1H. Go right to the bottom line on November 6th.
You've been listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Thanks to our listeners and viewers on Facebook Live for your questions. Now, coming up, we're going to be joined by two political analysts to talk about Griebel's candidacy. With 3 weeks to go before Election Day, what do you want to hear from these candidates before you cast your ballot? The number to call, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Be a part of our audience this Monday. Where We Live is going to broadcast a show from inside MGM Springfield. MGM's opening in downtown Springfield marks the start of new competition for Connecticut's Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun casinos. So on that next show, Monday, we're going to sit down with casino officials and some reporters, and we want to hear from you too. You can join us live at 9 on Monday. Now, we just heard from Oz Griebel. He's running unaffiliated in Connecticut's governor's race. Now, what does he need to do in these next 3 weeks to push past the two major party candidates, Ned Lamont and Bob Stefanowski? Can his campaign really reach a wide number of voters, given the fact that he doesn't have a lot of money like Ned Lamont and Bob Stefanowski? Those are some of the questions I have for our two guests who are just joining us. Rennie Folco, Associate Professor of Legal and Policy Studies at Trinity College in Hartford. Thanks for coming in, Rennie.
My pleasure.
And Jonathan Wharton, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University. Jonathan, welcome back.
Thank you.
And Jonathan, we should say, just as to be transparent, you're also the political director for Kurt Miller, the GOP-endorsed candidate for Connecticut State Comptroller. But you're just here today to talk about Oz Griebel.
Indeed.
So what did you think of his answers and his campaign?
Well, I was very impressed, even with the debate last night. I mean, we discussed a little bit about that in the green room. He does come off, and I think he's a genuine policy wonk. And quite frankly, I like candidates like that, where it's not just rhetoric. And so he does offer some great examples on what's going on here in Connecticut with certain public policies and coming up with new ideas, fresh ideas, quite frankly. And I think it'd be useful for both parties.
Rennie.
Yeah, I think he did well both last night and in his discussion with you. And it's clear that he's knowledgeable and has a command of a lot of the issues, which is extremely important. My one question would be, and I wish, there were an opportunity to ask him because I didn't think of it actually even in advance. It was after listening to him. How would he work with what would be a Democratic legislature in Connecticut, and that as governor, you don't simply get to decide everything that's going to happen. And so I think we need to ask some questions of him in terms of how he would collaborate with others, and not just with the private sector, but with a whole other branch of government that gets to make a lot of decisions.
Now, the Democrats have been in control of the General Assembly for some time, but in the Senate, that was a very much, I think, a tie between Republicans and Democrats. And this coming election for the General Assembly, Jonathan, could we see it flip and it could be Republican-controlled General Assembly?
It could happen for both chambers, effectively. And it's very close, as you said, Lucy, with the Senate. And it's just a nail-biting situation with some of these elections, especially down the shoreline. We're seeing some contentious races going on there. And the professor brings up a good point. One has to wonder, what does it mean when you are another party? And what is, and even internally, we see what the dynamics of when you have an outsider, certainly somebody who's not been a part of an institutional party, try to operate a state government. I mean, bringing up the example of Phil Murphy, for example, in New Jersey. We're seeing all the dynamics of what takes place there with a business leader trying to effectively rein in the problems of a legislature.
Rennie.
Or not to mention at the national level. I mean, and so whether it's Democrat, Republican, if you have one house that goes one way and one the other, it seems to me you still have to work with a legislative body. And I didn't hear anything in his discussion about how he would take some very good ideas he has. But those are not all executive decisions. They're decisions that require legislation in many cases.
Jonathan, I wanted to go back to you. You mentioned you heard some fresh ideas. When I was listening to him, the idea of just using the rainy day fund and pushing back contributions to the pension fund, are those really fresh or new ideas? Are they more realistic than something that Ned Lamont or Bob Stefanowski are bringing to the table?
So last night we had a big viewing party on our campus at Southern, and a lot of my students kept on asking me questions about this rainy day fund and what is it all about. We couldn't stop debating about it for a half hour. I think the thing is that as a last resort, that should be something taken up for consideration. And clearly, it's a point of what happened with the debate last night. It was discussed for a while in discussion. I'm pointing more towards the example of what he said in terms of environmental issues and what he raised this morning. And I'm going to go back to even the Hartford Courant article that came out about his ideas for higher education specifically. He's more specific on the policies than I think the two other candidates.
We didn't get a chance to talk higher ed. What are some of Oz Griebel's points?
Well, he wants to go back and examine what can we do to consolidate the campuses again, to save some money. What can be done to kind of revive some additional reforms and approaches to deal with the administration with the university system, and what kind of connections, I hate bringing this up, especially as a professor at Southern, to connect back to the big flagship university, UConn. And that's a great question to bring back up. That was a discussion back in the 90s. Why can't we revive that about partnerships and working with a big state university like UConn to save some money? And he's brought that out. Both the two other candidates haven't.
Rennie, we hear so much frustration with the two major party system in this country, but yet we hear from callers. We heard from one today that says that they view a vote for an Oz Griebel as a wasted vote. When can we get past this? And is it time for Connecticut to consider ranked choice voting?
Oh, I mean, I think ranked choice voting actually could be a very good thing for a lot of reasons. But in the meantime, I do think it is difficult for somebody like Oz to break through. And I mean, I think he's had good opportunities in the debates. I think it's great that what you're doing here to give, listeners in Connecticut a chance to hear. But I do think it's extremely difficult, and it's because of the way money works in elections. And that's another piece of it.
Jonathan.
Well, it is difficult to break through, but I will give him credit. He's now getting double-digit. You've seen the
11%?
polls lately. Exactly, which, hey, he almost doubled that number in the last month. That's rare. And so one has to wonder, can he get to even 20%? And so we're seeing that kind of effectively take place. And that's a big question for both parties. And, of course, I think everything is on the table, to be fair. There's discussion about maybe, an open election, open primary, if that's possible, maybe caucuses. I mean, the parties have to reexamine what can we do to broaden out the base.
Yeah, and I would say particularly after this year where you really have three people running who did not come up through the usual, political processes, don't necessarily have that kind of experience. So in a way, you have people who are not as closely tied to political parties as we may have seen in the past. And I think it does raise questions, and it raises questions for me about, turnout and how that's going to work out in this election.
That's going to be critical. How many people are going to come out from the urban, rural, suburban areas? Is it going to be that much of an uptick? Because we're lucky to get maybe 35, 40% for these state races.
We've heard about the Trump effect on races within Congress, but is that enough to get people in Connecticut to vote for these state races?
I think it takes a little bit more, and I think what we're seeing in Connecticut especially is that there are some significant concerns here on the table. Budgetary issues, the future of the state, especially as it relates to the economy. I mean, this has to resonate with Connecticut voters, and if it doesn't this year, we're really in big trouble.
Yeah, and I guess what I think is who's going to come out because of the Trump effect regardless of who's running at the state level. In other words, I think this is an interesting year in terms of off-year elections because the president has made himself the issue on the ballot in so many states. Now, maybe less so here than in other places. But nevertheless, I think that for both parties, there are other issues that probably grab their attention more than the very important issues that you were talking about this morning.
The Trump effect and also Malloy effect. I mean, what does this mean for Malloy and his legacy as well? I mean, I think that's going to resonate with a lot of voters too.
You're hearing Jonathan Wharton, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern Connecticut State University, and Rennie Folco, Associate Professor of Legal and Policy Studies at Trinity College, here on Where We Live as we just talk about Oz Griebel's comments during our interview and what we should be looking for in the next 3 weeks. When we look at a candidate like Oz Griebel, is he going to be possibly a spoiler for Stefanowski or Lamont? Where will he pull votes from, Jonathan?
I think that's something that Rennie and I have been debating even in the green room.
Let's hear it.
Well, as I said to her, I think, Cosm Wisdom would say likely the Republican side of things. I know that a colleague that we know too well is Professor Rose, who said that it tends to be the Republican-leaning independents that might be a concern. We might see that effect taking place. But I won't discount the Democratic takeaway, too.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this is really interesting, and it's not clear to me, particularly because there is so much disaffection, because people are just so fed up and feeling angry, and because of, I think, the way Malloy has certainly been portrayed, and kind of the low approval ratings. I just don't know. I think it's going to be a very interesting election, and I'm not willing to go out on a limb on this one.
Well, for both parties. I mean, there's a lot of jaded and really disaffected voters out there. I mean, they are really angry, and that's why it explains why we only have 21% Republicans and double that for the Democrats. There are a lot of independent voters and unaffiliated voters out there in Connecticut.
Right.
And who of the five candidates? So we had Griebel on today, and next we're going to have Stefanowski and Lamont. There's the Libertarian candidate, also this other party, the Amigo Party. When you look at the largest bloc, the unaffiliateds, who are they leaning towards? What are you hearing from your students who live in Connecticut that are looking to vote? I
have an awful lot of students who are independent, unaffiliated voters, and I'm constantly angry with them because I'm like, join a party so you can be part of the primary in the first place. But there's this frustration among Generation Y and Z, and I get it, who just don't like the party system, and it stinks. But I think the thing is that, at the end of the day, they're going to, I think, split up in various different directions. How many are going to actually show up? That's going to be the question. I'd love to know the turnout from that base.
What are your students telling you?
Well, I have kind of a self-selected group in the program I teach. They tend to be just very socially and politically active. It's the public policy and law program. But I would say probably almost all of them are independent, or the vast majority, or that's what they will say, is that they're unaffiliated. And it is not at all clear to me how many of them are actually going to vote. I mean, I have tried to impress on them how important it doesn't matter which way you vote because you form your habits about voting as a young person. Get out there and do it, or you don't get a right to complain. And that's sort of my little motto in the classroom. But I can't tell. I think it depends on the particular population. I would say among women, the women that I see tend to be a little bit more motivated about voting. And perhaps that's because of the Kavanaugh thing and just general attitudes about Trump.
As I mentioned, we have the major party candidates coming in next Thursday on Where We Live, Bob Stefanowski, next Friday, Ned Lamont. What are the questions we should be asking them? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
I'd love to know how the campaign trail is treating them because they're going to all different parts of the state, and I'd love to hear some feedback on what they're faced with in terms of what they're hearing out there from various parts of regions. I mean, we have such a diverse political topography out there in Connecticut. So I'd love to hear some feedback on what that's like.
Rennie?
And push them a little harder on what they're actually going to do.
Specifics.
Yes. And have some specific questions ready that they just can't, kind of back away from.
I'm glad you mentioned that because when we watch the debates, the journalists are trying to get those details, but the candidates aren't biting. So it's interesting that when you mention looking at Malloy's legacy, Jonathan, all you have to say is Ned Lamont, he's pretty much just Dan Malloy.
Right.
And vice versa, that, Ned Lamont saying, Bob Stefanowski, you're voting for Trump if you vote for him.
Right. And I think that's just the usual political rhetoric you're going to get from both sides because it resonates with their bases. So the big question is, what does that mean for the independent unaffiliated voters, going back to that group?
And just the last word I would say about that, typically those are the people who vote in off-term elections,
Good
right?
point.
Off-year elections.
It's the party base.
It's the party base. And the question for me is going to be, will turnout be greater because of other things that are going on?
We'll have to leave it there. Rennie Folco, Associate Professor of Legal and Policy Studies at Trinity. Thank you, Rennie. Also,
My
Jonathan
pleasure.
Wharton, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Urban Affairs at Southern. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thanks to our digital producer, Carlos Mejia, for putting on this on Facebook Live. Thanks to our viewers, our listeners who called in. And we hope to hear from you again. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.